All right, I'm in studio with me. I do have Ntombi Mbele-Thomo. She's an independent economist, and online we have Professor Brooks Spector. He's a political analyst and a former US diplomat to discuss the latest elections. The professor is not yet with us, but he will join us a little bit later. Ntombi, thank you so much for joining us. Wow, you know, this decision happened very quickly. We're seeing that he's just a few points away from that 270 point electoral vote number, magic number. He's already made his victory speech, but off the bat, what does this mean economically for South Africa?
I think, well, firstly, thank you so much for having me this afternoon. I think that I think as an economy would have been in a much better position having the Harris presidency for reasons that we already know. We know that Donald Trump is looking to increase and impose sanctions, as Stuart had mentioned. And for a country that is a signatory in AGOA, as South Africa, that has grave consequences. Because as we know, in 2025, there'll be the renewal of AGOA. And as we know that Trump has said that, you know, there'll be conditions really that will be linked towards the renewing of AGOA. And as he's mentioned, he's much more focused on a more bilateral engagement, even for trade purposes with countries. And so that really makes us wonder what will be the outcome in terms of AGOA. Will there be a renewal that is not contingent to political alignment? As we know, South Africa is also part of BRICS, which has Iran and also has China and Russia, who are not really the biggest friends of America. So that makes us really be a bit more cautious as to how we need to have our, you know, diplomatic relations with the US, particularly with the concern to economics.
Yes. And what about for the broader African continent, you know, in terms of the US's approach to it? Because we know that in his previous tenure as president, he really didn't have that much regard for the African continent.
That is very true. That's very true. And I do not see there being much of a change with the break that he's had of not being president, but with now the continuity of his 47th presidency. I do recognize that we also have our African Continental Free Trade Area that we are still ratifying, and we're still trying to really organize ourselves in terms of what will be the core, apart from free and open trade, but what are the desired outcomes that we want to have as a continent. And I don't really see there being Trump being the first person to raise his hand to provide support for the African continent. And so I am very skeptical, to say the least, around what will be, if there will be any support for Africa from the US. As he's mentioned, he wants to be more bilateral in his engagements, firstly, but also secondly, if there'll be benefit for trade. He has a very nationalistic agenda. And I think that is a cause for concern because we operate within the World Trade Organization. And I don't see him really being a president who's going to upkeep and upstand some of the trade agreements that were initially engaged in by the US government.
Very serious implications there. Welcome, Professor Spector. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. You are live on air and we can see you. I hope he can hear us. Where do you think, okay, I think the Professor, can you hear me? I hope you can hear me.
No, I'm hearing you. I just happen to see you.
Oh, okay, not a problem. So my question to you is, where do you think the Kamala Harris campaign went wrong? Or was she always going to be at a disadvantage because she's a woman and also a woman of color at that?
Well, that's a key question. I think part of the problem was that not that she was female, not that she was dark complected, but that remember how she became the candidate. She took over the candidacy when the incumbent president stepped back from this. In the first couple of weeks, she was doing very well, actually. There was a great deal of enthusiasm. There was positive media coverage everywhere. She had a good convention. She had an excellent debate. There was a sense of possibility. The problem was that the issues Donald Trump raised as his flagship issues, fear of immigration, concern about the economy, and in particular, what we call the kitchen table economic issues, those were sufficiently fierce that people bought into those dramatically. Her key issues, Kamala Harris's, women's reproductive rights obviously were very important to many people, but they paled by comparison to Trump's arguments. The fourth issue, the one that Kamala Harris raised, which was the defense of democracy and democratic principles, really never got sufficient traction. Now, it's very clear that the way in which Donald Trump raised immigration and economics, there was a great deal of duplicitousness within his conversation, but you can trade on fear and do well. And then the other part of it is, of course, the international economic issues. He managed to make it very clear that the primary economic concern internationally was competition from China, and that therefore his proposed remedy was to increase tariffs rather dramatically. Now, that's going to have an effect on world trade generally, and I think it should be pointed out that if it comes to pass, that will have a significant impact on South Africa and Africa generally. South Africa remains with a trade surplus with the United States, and that, of course, translates into jobs and economic growth. Absent the ability to export goods and services to the U.S. or to have lesser of those exported runs a risk to this economy. One thing I want to make clear about, it was mentioned earlier, about the African Growth and Opportunity Act, AGOA. This is not a treaty. This is unilateral U.S. legislation that allows duty-free entry into the United States of, in this case, South African products, especially things like assembled motor cars, automobile parts, and processed agricultural commodities. And you should think in terms of high-quality wines when you talk about that. Losing AGOA access will translate in some manner to the loss of jobs, and in some manner to the loss of growth or economic activity for some industries. Part of the problem is that, as your other panelists explained, Donald Trump sees foreign trade as a distinctly reciprocal transactional activity. In other words, there are no altruistic, there are no individual benefits that are given. Everything must be a trade. Everything must be reciprocal.
Yeah, Professor, can I come in there? Can I come in there
Yeah.
and ask you the specific question around AGOA? Because we know that there are already Republican murmurings, members of Congress who wanted to oust South Africa out of the AGOA because they said, or they deemed that our conduct as a country did not align with their national security concerns for whatever reason. And so they had already started agitating in that direction. And given the fact that the Republicans now have the Senate, and no doubt they'll get a big chunk of the House, is it then likely, because as you've told us, it's a piece of legislation, is it then likely for political reasons that they will actually decide not to include South Africa? And that's the main question that I want to ask you. The implications thereof, I'll be putting to Ntombi.
Yeah, I mean, it is distinctly possible that they will carve South Africa out of AGOA if it is renewed. There is the question about whether or not it would even be renewed in the first place. The people in the House who have spoken against South Africa's continued inclusion, that up until now, that certainly did not represent a majority view, but to the extent to which South Africa has been unable or unwilling to make the case that it should be included because it is beneficial for America that South Africa is included, is, I think, a very difficult hill for South Africa to climb. I know there have been a couple of delegations to the U.S., and they came back saying we had all the handshakes, we had smiles, we had the photograph, everybody, there was much love, we kissed, we hugged, everything was great. But that did not translate into making Congress feel comfortable. And in fact, I think there was very little interaction with congressional aides, which are, unlike a legislature like South Africa's, congressional aides in the United States, assistants and staff members, they are very powerful people, and you need to make them feel that you understand their concerns and that they feel your love or at least your respect. And I'm not entirely sure that happened on those last couple of visits. As a result, if the president is Republican and if the Senate and the House are Republican, there is going to be some rough sailing on this question.
Yeah. Ntombi, very worrying what the professor's saying. He's laying it out clear. He's an American himself. He understands the psyche. He's once been a diplomat and so on. But, you know, oftentimes when we speak about AGOA and the implications of it being removed, some people have said, oh, well, it's inconsequential, really. But my understanding is that quite a number, hundreds of thousands of jobs could depend on it. And also, there are sort of components and things that come from other African countries that feed into, you know, final goods that go off to South Africa, to go off to the United States from South Africa. So from your perspective, how serious would losing AGOA be for the South African economy and the wider continent?
I think, Ntombi, it definitely is not true that it would be of no consequence to lose AGOA as South Africa, because as you rightfully mentioned, there's job opportunities that have been created by the AGOA. And because of that, there is livelihoods that we need to be concerned about, especially in an economy, South Africa, that is already struggling to provide structured employment and consistent, you know, employment for people who are either unskilled or semi-skilled. And you find that the industries that the AGOA has been able to propel, for example, like citrus, right? They've been able to provide people who are typically unskilled to provide the export of citrus into the US. That's fine when you look at it from a margin point of view. But when you look at, you know, your automobile industry, which is a huge revenue generating and contributing sector to our GDP, that is of consequence, because you understand that there's a significant value chain and there's employment being created in each of the segment of the value chain. And it also, as you rightfully put, is not only subjected to South African structure and employment opportunities, but also within the African countries. And so that on its own it will be a bloodbath, really, in terms of employment. And as you know, it's a really tough economic climate currently. We are really trying to scrape for jobs, you know, in this economy. And so having an increased pool of individuals who are not working is going to be of dire consequence for South Africa. But I also think it would be remiss of me not to, you know, concur with Prof when he mentioned that what Trump was able to successfully do in this election was to get the buy-in of Americans around the strategy of being able to, you know, speak about shifting the global production value back to the US. That is really what he wants to do with these tariffs. And people were able to look at that and look at their realities and then be able to draw parallels and say, if we vote for him, this is what is likely to be the outcome of our next 4 years. And so these are some of the things that even in Washington are being a conversation around looking at the increase of tariffs and what that will mean for the production values of the United States. So I think those are the key, you know, consequences in terms of what, you know, the US wants to achieve, and that's the objective under a Trump presidency, and on the aspect of AGOA, what it means for South African industries, but particularly for the lives of individuals that work in these industries.
Yeah. Prof, looking at the wider US foreign policy and, of course, the issues that we're all kind of looking at very closely, the Russia-Ukraine war, as well as what's happening in the Middle East, what do you suppose Donald Trump's first order of business will be in relation to those conflicts when he takes office in January next year?
Yeah, I think those are important points. Donald Trump has been very clear about the nature of the war that the Russians are engaged in Ukraine. He said a number of times that no problem, I can fix it, a phone call and it's done. And of course, a phone call and it's done is not the case, because, unless it is done entirely on Vladimir Putin's terms, perhaps. What that means is, if you are worried about the stability of defense material flowing to Ukraine, you should be worried. If you are in Ukraine and you are worried about the continued support of the United States in their travails, you should be worried. With regard to the Middle East, it's quite clear that between the two candidates, Donald Trump's position vis-a-vis support for Israel was much stronger and much more vociferous. In his previous term of office, he carried out a number of policies which made it quite clear where his sympathies were. If I were in Tehran, I would similarly also be a little bit more concerned than I am now, because one of the other hallmarks about Donald Trump that we haven't discussed yet, but which are important, is his unpredictability, the inability of people to be able to accurately and successfully gauge what his response will be to something. And that in foreign affairs becomes very problematic for your antagonists as well as your colleagues.
Ntombi, I want to find out, I mean, on the one hand, and we've had this conversation earlier, Prof referred to it, you referred to it, about the expectation that Donald Trump's policies would actually invite further inflation. The globe's done so well in helping to bring inflation down. We've started to see central banks bringing down interest rates with the hope that the Fed is going to cut interest rates further again tomorrow, and later our very own Reserve Bank. But if that is the case, why then, you know, for people watching at home who can't get their head around it, why then are the markets up? Why are we celebrating a Trump victory?
I think it would be because the market already knows that Trump is a businessman and they have experienced his presidency. So I think from that point of view, they are quite appreciative and kind of understand where they stand when it comes to the business markets and capital markets. But I think when it comes to inflation, the real reason that there'll be an inflation hike is because with tariffs, there'll be a rise in the prices, right, of being able, as a South African trying to buy goods. With tariffs in the US, it's going to be much higher. So that already will impact my ability and my buying concern. And so that will affect the purchasing power, which will drive up prices and therefore will have inflation. But I don't think that will happen, of course, in the next medium term. But it is something that is likely to happen perhaps sometimes next year, we start seeing again the impact of these policies, and they start being much more concrete in terms of what it is that his presidency wants to do. But as the Prof also mentioned, unpredictability is one of Trump's favorite cards to play.
Exactly.
And so that on its own makes the market to quite wonder, and the pricing sometimes becomes a problem. And so that's why the price will be priced much higher and might sometimes cause the inflation to be pushed upward.
All right. Thank you so much to the both of you for participating in this panel discussion at this very interesting time in our lives. That was Ntombi Mbele-Thomo. She's an independent economist, and Professor Brooks Spector. He's a political analyst and a former US diplomat. Local markets are currently in the red, with the JSE slipping 0.1% to 86,539 index points. The rand has taken a knock. It's trading at around 17.60 vis-a-vis the US dollar, 22.71 against the euro, and 18.93 against the pound. Actually, that is not correct. It's probably 22 against the UK currency and 18.93 against the euro. Commodities also are weaker today. The price of gold is trading at $2,721 an ounce. Platinum trading at $998 an ounce, while Brent crude is trading at $74.20 a barrel.